Thank you, Maurice. So, as Maurice mentioned, we have two distinguished professors who have graciously agreed to come and animate us and give us their perspective. So, to my left, I have Tony Gorst, who lectures in history at the University of Westminster. He researches and writes on British foreign and defense policy since the Second World War, and he's the co-author with Lewis Lohman of the Suez Crisis, which is a very interesting book because he goes back to original documents like the Sèvres Accord, like minutes of the cabinet, and he sort of takes us through the whole history of the crisis. And also with Scott Lucas of Suez 56 Strategy and Diplomatic Process. Also, as well, he has co-authored a book of cartoons on the Suez crisis, Suicide, which I'll leave the copy here. It's really worth your while perusing through it, later on. To my right, I have Dr. Nathan Aridan. He was actually born not far from here, somewhere, he tells me, between Hendon and Finchley. But he did Aliyah about, 36 years ago. And he is now a researcher at the Ben-Gurion Research Institute for the Study of Israel and Zionism at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Beersheba. He is the editor of Israel Studies, and he lectures on Israeli diplomacy, diaspora relations, and, interestingly, the contribution of women to Israeli diplomacy. And amongst his publications, we have Britain, Israel, and Anglo Jewry, and his forthcoming book to be published next year, Diplomats and Advocates for Israel, From Truman to Ford, which will be published next year. So let me immediately hand over to Tony, who is going to give us, let's say, the British perspective.
Okay, is that okay, volume-wise? Yeah? No? Okay, I'll try and speak up. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me here today. And I guess my problem is where to start. Should we go back to 1868, 69 with the opening of the canal? Should we talk about the occupation of Egypt? Should we talk about the 36 base agreement, Anglo-Egyptian treaty rather? But given the time constraints of approximately 10 minutes and given the 100,000 words or so, I thought probably the best place to start would be the 54 base agreement signed between Britain and Egypt, which brought to an end British occupation, if you like, of Egypt, with the base agreement signifying the withdrawal of British troops from the Suez Canal base 20 months after the signature, so in June 1956. The base agreement is interesting.
It's okay.
I feel like a sort of rock concert here where all of a sudden you get feedback. I guess it's interesting for two reasons. This is kind of the high point of Anthony Eden's kind of diplomatic career, the great gilded diplomat. And you have the photographs that are reproduced fairly frequently of Anthony Eden and Colonel Nasser happily shaking hands and apparently sharing a joke. It's a very short-lived triumph, obviously, and the kind of rapprochement, if you like, between Nasser and Eden and between Egypt and Britain is very short-lived, in part because of, and this is kind of why I'm interested in the Suez crisis, the intersection of Cold War issues and kind of, let's call them colonial or legacies of colonialism. And that is the Northern Tier, the Baghdad Pact, which is signed in 1955. Which kind of raises in Nasser's mind the problem of who is at the power center in the Middle East. Is it Egypt? Is it Iraq? And the fact that Britain is now, or continuing to back Iraq and the Hashemite kingdom there, causes a derailment, should we say, in this nascent Anglo-Egyptian relationship. The result is NASA turns to the Soviet Union for arms, resulting in the Czech arms deal in September. I'm a historian. I don't really do precise dates. In the ballpark region of towards the end of '55. And this, together with NASA's pan-Arabism plus his anti-imperial propaganda, really alienates both the British government and particularly Eden and, of course, France. Now, for me, another break point is March 1956. And this is where I suppose you can really talk about the descent to Suez, in that here, with the anti-British riot in Bahrain and the stoning of Lloyd, the British Foreign Secretary, well, his car anyway, and the sacking of Glub in Jordan, all of that leads the British cabinet at best to decide not to work with NASA, at worst, in the words attributed to Eden by Anthony Nutting, that he wanted NASA destroyed. So that's the kind of why I think March '56 is kind of the interesting, one of the interesting pivot points here. Moving on to the crisis itself, the nationalisation of the crisis actually catches the British very much on the hop. They're not really expecting this, and they're not really prepared for it. They have no military plans in preparation. They had a couple of old plans sitting on the dusty shelves of Whitehall somewhere, but nothing that really kind of related to this nationalisation. The second problem that's posed by the nationalisation of the Suez Canal Company is the question of the legitimacy of this, because the legal advice to the British government is that they would be on very shaky international ground in terms of international law in launching a military intervention. So there's a real problem here for the British. They are neither militarily prepared nor do they have a kind of legal case for any intervention, which of course then forces them down the diplomatic line. And for the next 2 months or so, between August '56 and into early October 1956, you have the British forced almost wholly reluctantly on the part of Eden, down the route of diplomatic negotiations via the London Conference, the 18-nation conference, and then via the Suez Canal Users Association discussions, all attempting to come up with some kind of framework for a continued international use of the canal. And that, of course, then raises the question of, I suppose, the elephant in the room here, which is the United States. From the British end, in an ideal world, they would have had the complete backing of the United States. In the real world, that backing was not forthcoming. And this is a real kind of question for scholars, and remains so to this day. How did the British get it so wrong with the question of American backing? That consistently Eisenhower and Dulles told Eden, whatever you do, do not use force until the last possible resort. Now, it's a question what the last possible resort is, but the clear message to Eden and the British cabinet was, do not attempt to shoot your way through the canal. This leaves the British on the kind of horns of a dilemma. They are forced to refer the Suez Canal dispute to the United Nations, to the point at which, by the middle of October, 10th, 12th, something like that, there's almost a settlement, the so-called Six Principles, which would have left Nasser in power and would have come up with a solution for the running of the canal. And it's exactly that Eden doesn't want. And therefore, this raises the question of how do you get a casus belli? How do you get a justification for British intervention? They tried Operation Pile Up, which was to kind of try and overwhelm the canal by shipping. That hadn't worked. So what is the solution? The military operations, the military planning and military preparations have been going on since late July, in cooperation with the French. The French very eager to topple Nasser. There'd been various plans, Musketeer Revise, variously an invasion of either Port Said or Alexandria before finally settling on Port Said. So at the time there's their negotiations with the UN, the military arrangements, the military planning is coming to the boil, as it were. And the problem for Eden, therefore, and the British, is you have a diplomatic solution in the wings, one that is not much liked by Eden, and you have a military operation ready to go, but that could not be held for much longer. Questions of holding the forces at readiness, questions of the reservists, questions of the weather in the Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, I didn't know about the weather in the Eastern Mediterranean. I'm from Lancashire. What do I know? But these kind of factors are raising the crisis in the middle of October to kind of absolute fever pitch in terms of what is going to get Eden and the British government off this particular horns of a dilemma. And I guess at this point, I hand over to Nathan.
Thank you. That was nice and short, which gives me 2 more minutes. How wonderful it is that brothers and sisters are gathered here together. I'm very privileged to be here. I've adapted my lecture to be gathering here, and I want to quote from a debate in the Israeli Knesset on the 28th of November 1956. Ben-Gurion tells the Knesset, "During the last few days, horrifying news has reached us, which has been verified by exiled Jews who have managed to reach Israel, meanwhile, as well as by external sources in Egypt, of wicked, cruel acts perpetrated by the Egyptian tyrant and his government against the Jewish inhabitants of Egypt. All these acts remind us of what Hitler did before the war. As of themselves, these deeds are extremely serious, and decent world public opinion, which we believe exists, cannot stand by passively. Today we want to remind the world, which did not heed our warnings about Hitler's Mein Kampf and dismissed it as mere nonsense which no one would ever implement. The most terrible deeds mankind has ever known were perpetrated. I must remind you that during the Sinai campaign, we found many vehicles belonging to Egyptian officers upon which swastikas have been painted. Many of them possessed Arabic translations of Mein Kampf. This is the education the Egyptian tyrant is giving his officers. This bodes ill for the future of Egyptian Jewry, unless the world takes effective and immediate steps against such deeds." Before the Suez crisis, there was a very important document moved between the Americans and the British called Project Alpha. And in terms of summing up the British views towards Israel, the ambassador, Sir John Nichols, writes, the centre of infection, sorry, this is March 1955, the centre of infection in the region is Israel, and I believe that we must treat the Israelis as a sick people. Their illness is psychological. It is not reasonable to expect that a nation made up of individuals so psychologically unstable should be capable of a mature foreign policy, although their superior intelligence tempts one to expect it of them. If one is looking for the juncture of why Israel goes to war in 1956, it lies in the Egyptian, Czechoslovakian, Soviet military arrangement of the 27th of September, which basically means that within a year or so, at the disposal of the Egyptian government, will be weapons such as, if the average Israeli tank can fire 800 meters, the Egyptians will have a tank that fires 2,000 meters. This will not be used against Sudan and Libya, and I offer you to guess which country this might be used against. So for Israel, the clock is ticking. In terms of what the dilemma is, can Israel go to the UN and say that Nasser is aiming to destroy Israel? The answer is no, because the Soviets could say that American NATO missiles are aimed at them, and therefore they would allow first strike, and vice versa. The heroes and the heroines are the French. As you know, the French were fighting a civil war in Algeria, and it was Israeli Mossad that was supplying the French with very detailed information about the support that Nasser was giving militarily, financially, and with soldiers. And what happens in the summer of 1956, the French basically work out a scenario which later comes into existence. On the 27th of September, 1956, Ben-Gurion sends Foreign Minister Golda Meir to have secret negotiations with the French at Saint-Germain, and he gives her instructions. We will not go into action alone. We will not participate in the operation unless Britain agrees to our inclusion. He talks about having knowledge of the Americans. We have to make a clear difference to our friends, the difference between our situation and theirs, meaning the French and the British. For them, if it's a failure, it is a political or military failure which does not affect their country, but only their prestige. For us, failure may mean destruction. And then he talks about demilitarizing the Suez Canal, etc., etc. As a result, the Israelis decide that they're going to join secret talks with the French in Sèvres, which is on the outskirts of Paris. Now, Ben-Gurion keeps a diary, and the diary is very, very accurate. By the way, 1986, I was approached for the 100th anniversary of Ben-Gurion to find where Ben-Gurion lived and put a blue plaque. Just over the road in Warrington Avenue, there is a blue plaque on where Ben-Gurion stayed during the Second World War. Ben-Gurion talks about the problem here, that Israel is going to sign a document, not sign a document, they didn't realize it was going to collude with two imperialist countries in which they have as their aims imperialists. They want to remain on the Suez Canal, etc. And what Israel is going to be expected to do is to basically invade Egypt with a certain amount of French help in terms of bombing. And then afterwards, Israel is going to be condemned. In fact, what happens, Israel is condemned by the United Nations, by the Soviet Union, by the United States, all within 24 hours. And later on, the French and the British will also condemn Israel. So why does Ben-Gurion, this, in a small country, decide that this is what is going to happen? And one of the marvelous things of using documents or diaries is the questions that leaders ask themselves. And one of the questions that Ben-Gurion asks when he's at the Sèvres conference is not only what sort of source we're going to use, but how do we get our troops back? The history of man and womankind is that very often we go into wars, but we have no plan about how to bring our soldiers back. And what happens at Sèvres, we have various different accounts. Now, if we were to go to the account of Selwyn Lloyd at the time, who has the chutzpah of writing a book called Suez, 1956, but just happens to admit that he was there, that the British knew about it, and the British actually signed a document to this effect. And when the document was signed, it was in French, the lingua franca of the time. No one actually thought about keeping a protocol. But since the, by the way, in terms of the Israelis, Ben-Gurion sends himself and Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, buy one, get one free. You have Moshe Dayan. Whenever I tell my students that when Ben-Gurion was writing, and Yeshavti in Moshe Ba'alba Enayim, when I was sitting with 4 eyes, then you know that he was talking with Moshe Sharet. But when he's talking about 3 eyes, you know that it was Moshe Dayan. And what happens here is that the British, they decide to work out a protocol. And this protocol, for some reason, has gone missing. The British destroyed theirs originally. In fact, when the British delegates came to Croydon Airport and they said to Anthony Eden, we have this document which we signed, the pilot was sent straight back to the French military airport to get it back. By that time, Ben-Gurion was on his way home. The French document has gone amiss. But the document which was signed, which doesn't exist officially, by the way, is in our archive at Stepelker. So what is it, and why is it that the Israelis decide that they are going to participate? Now, they had absolute confidence with the French. There was a honeymoon with the French. Already by the end of 1954, the French were sending in planes, to the point that when the new French ambassador came, Pierre Gilbert, he spoke fluent Hebrew. And the aircraft at the time were Mystère. So instead of calling him Monsieur Gilbert, they called him Mystère Gilbert. And what was happening here is that the French promised Israel some understanding of helping Israel with nuclear knowledge, to the point that a number of brilliant students studying physics and mathematics, especially at the Hebrew University, were given crash courses in French, including, by the way, Shimon Peres, who starts to learn French. And this rapprochement is happening with the French. And even on the eve of the attack on the 29th of October, I interviewed British pilots taking off from Cyprus, and they were convinced that they were going to bomb Israeli airfields. And the question with the French, there was this, certainly this understanding and agreement. Now, why I mention this is that one of the clauses that Ben-Gurion has to deal with, and that is how does he tell the rest of the government, the Israeli government? Now, until that time, there were various reprisal attacks, but this was going to be an attack against Egypt. And Israel is a democracy. And so something which is important to understand how decisions are made, what you do, first of all, you gather your own ministers from APAI, the ruling party, who explain there's going to be some sort of attack, but you don't use the word war. Having agreed, you go to the next fraction. And so when you get everyone together at the cabinet, everyone has already agreed as to what is going to happen. As a result, Israel attacks Egypt on the 29th of October. It was, by the way, in French literature, if you look at the books, it was called the 7 Days War after the attack. And within 7 days, Israel had conquered Sinai, taken over Gaza, etc., etc.
Sharm el-Sheikh.
Sharm el-Sheikh, etc. Now, the thing which I think is important to understand is to what extent were Israel's aims accepted, because Israel had hoped that it would have, there would be demilitarization of the straits. It never happened. No international waterways. Nasser still remains in power, and Nasser turns a military defeat into a political victory, and as a result, the whole of the Middle East is affected by Nasserism. This is the period of decolonialization in which Nasser stands out as being the #1 leader against Western imperialism. But for Israel, and this is the real genius of Ben-Gurion, is that you lose lots of chess pieces, but the ultimate chess piece, and no one knows what's going to happen, because I don't know in Dimona, because I've always been told it's a textile factory, and which will be open to international students to be able to do research on. We're still waiting. But it would give Israel the ultimate deterrent, and as a result, no other Arab armies would therefore attack. The last point I want to make in the last minute, which I have, and that is, how did the Suez Crisis affect Anglo-Jewry? It rocked Anglo-Jewry to its fundamentals. There were 19 Jewish members of parliament. 17 of them were members of the Labour Party, including Barnett Janner, who was head of the Board of Deputies and also the English Zionist Federation. And in the morning, they are attacking in Parliament, condemning Israel's actions, and in the afternoon, on the demonstration, going to justify why Israel has a right to defend itself. And Anglo-Jewry and the Board of Deputies, which I've written extensively in my book, really rocked Anglo-Jewry. If you go to the pages of the Jewish Chronicle, you can understand Jewish MPs were MPs. They voted with their party, etc. And in France, there were Janner was condemned, etc., by having different parties. So to sum up then, for Israel, this wasn't collusion. Israel had its own justifications of why it was going to, for various reasons, collaborate with the French in order to make sure that the Egyptians would not be able to attack. In the end, Israel was forced out of Sinai, mainly to do with the Americans, who decided that they were going to support sanctions. And it's important here to understand that a week before the Suez Crisis, there was the invasion of Hungary. And not only were Egyptian Jews here as refugees, but also Hungarian Jews who came to this country and were absorbed and integrated by the wonderful community here. And so if the United States was trying to push the United Nations to condemn Soviet invasion of Hungary, how could it not do so in condemning Israel's invasion of the Sinai? And the last resort was to cut off funding from Jews to Israel. And in the end, Israel basically leaves. I'd be very happy to answer any questions later on and to listen to you as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both of you. I'd just like, I don't want to add much, but there's two things that struck me when, in preparation for this, I was reading a few books up, including, the ones by our authors here. First of all, it is interesting to note, if you look at the French, that the military commanders involved were, the head of the aviation was General Chal, and the head of the paratroopers were Massu. And they were the part of the putsch of Algiers later on against de Gaulle. De Gaulle, who called them le carteron d'officiers en retraite. The other thing on the other side is there was a definite anti-Semitic feeling within Britain at the time, particularly at the higher level. At a meeting in cabinet on the 2nd of October, Eden reported to the cabinet, the Jews have come up with an offer, not Israel, the Jews. Later on, there was a meeting of the British military high command to plan the Operation Musketeer, and one of them said, I've heard the hook-nosed boys are going to be bought in. So you can see the general, apart from the Foreign Office, who was obviously very keen to preserve the relationship of Britain with the Arab world, there was also this very sort of latent, gut anti-Semitic of the Egyptian higher class. Can I perhaps ask both of you, perhaps to can I perhaps ask both of you now, perhaps to enlarge a bit on the consequences, post-Suez, east of Suez, etc. And particularly, I have one question. There's always this debate. Was Suez the beginning of England decline, or was it actually, it had already started, and what Suez did, it just cruelly exposed it?
I guess I'm with Peter Hennessy here, who called Suez, I think, the lightning flash that revealed reality. The reality is that British decline starts, possibly before even the First World War. It depends what you look at in terms of decline. I mean, Suez certainly exposes the deficiencies of the British economy rather cruelly, in the same way that the kind of sterling crises of 47, 48, or indeed 67, 68, the run on sterling provoked by British actions at Suez and by American actions, refusal of a loan from the IMF, etc., kind of illustrates the economic weakness of Britain. There used to be in the kind of histories, the historiography, a kind of straight line drawn between Suez and British decolonisation, that Suez happened and then the African empire went. I don't think it's quite that straight line, in that if you look, for example, at Ghana, first African colony to become independent post-Suez, I mean, the constitutional negotiations have been going on since the Accra riots of 1948, so long-term consequences. Obviously, Britain's position in the Middle East much diminished, alienated the Israelis, alienated many of its Arab allies as well, replaced by the United States, Eisenhower Doctrine and all of that. Still a significant player in the early 60s, 61, intervention in Kuwait and so on, but certainly it is a marker point on that kind of road to decline that maybe ends with the 68 East of Suez decision. Yeah.
Suez can be defined as the lion's last roar. After 45, before that, if you think of maybe a soccer competition, there was basically a league. Now, after 45, there are two leagues. There's a Super League, which is the United States and the Soviet Union, and then you have the ordinary league in Britain. And I think one of the important things is to look at who are the main decision makers. Just as much as generals tend to fight the last war, you have Anthony Eden as Prime Minister. And it was Anthony Eden who had resigned over appeasement and in the Chamberlain government. Although it was Anthony Eden, the architect of the Arab League. And here, although Anthony Eden never called Nasser Hitler, in fact, many Mussolini, it was Guy Mollet who called him, this was a feeling that if we don't stop the rot now, then everything else is going to continue. And I think this is part of the problem, that not being able to understand the limits of power. One of the things that I always tell my students, you can have an atomic bomb, you can have everything, but the most important thing is, what are the limits of power? And that is something that I think that the British government, whether in fact it was the Labour government until 51, or the Churchill-Eden government later on, failed to understand. The other thing is, and that was the absolute military failure of the British, called a snafu, which I'm not going to translate what the F might be, but all the materiel for when Britain was going to send its troops into Port Said, in fact, all the material for the first day was put at the bottom of the ship. So it took them more than 36 hours to get all the material on top. Now, the other thing is, how many people knew about Suez? And that was probably no more than 2 members of cabinet. When there were protocols of the cabinet, there were very often more than just one protocol. Protocol for 2 or 3 people who knew, and the protocol for people who didn't know. But this certainly did mark an end for British power. The other thing is, in terms of Israel's consequences, which it failed in most of its aims, but it showed that Israel could fend for itself. It has shown that Israel was willing to take the necessary measures to defend itself, and that this was a message also to the Arabs that basically what happened in 48 wasn't just to do with the disunity in the Arabs, but that Israel could do it alone with French arms, not American.
Tony, would you like to say a few words about how the US-UK relationship was the so-called special accord, or which special relationship we've been hearing so much over the past 10 days, was influenced by the personal enmity and the dislike between Eden and Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State?
My professor at the LSE, Donald Cameron Watt, wrote a book called Personalities and Policies, and I think there is a fundamental clash in kind of personalities between Eden and Dulles, which kind of doesn't do any favours for the smooth flow of Anglo-American relations, either before the crisis or indeed after the crisis, during the crisis. As I say, that there is this fundamental disconnect between what the British are being told consistently by Dulles and by Eisenhower. You can read the letters, the private letters of Eisenhower to Eden. And the message is just very, very clear. So how is it that Eden deceived himself into believing that the Americans would go along with this? Donald Neff, I think, pointed to Eden's illness. He'd undergone a serious operation and so on and so forth. Other historians have pointed to the role of Harold Macmillan, the beneficiary of Suez in British political terms. Eden resigns, Macmillan comes in as Prime Minister. Coincidentally, Macmillan had seen Eisenhower in late September '56 and had come back to Britain and says to Eden, look, it's all fine. Ike will be with us. I'm not one for conspiracy theories.
Just on a small note, I mean, of course one needs personal chemistry, but one of the things that I think people fail to understand is that Churchill was half American. He was regarded as American. He didn't have a private income, and he managed to earn his money by giving lecture tours and writing articles. The mid-gap was Eden, and then you had another half American, Macmillan. Yeah. And I think, although it's not everything, we shouldn't read too much into it, but the natural sympathy of the United States for Macmillan and Churchill wasn't accorded to Eden.
I think also if we look at the consequences and we look at the third party, in France, Guy Mollet also resigned in about, I think, May, June 1957. So Ben-Gurion and Nasser ultimately were the only two of the protagonists who stayed in place. One of the questions also is, did we have to go to war? There were negotiations, and I think as you pointed out in your book, the final agreement that was signed in 1957 was very, very close to the 6 principles that had been outlined, and Hammarskjöld of the United Nations drafted them, and even Fawzi, the Egyptian foreign minister, had agreed to them.
Do they have to go to war? I think the problem is that Eden and the kind of inner circle of the British cabinet, the so-called Egypt Committee, who were the ones in the know, as it were, rather than the wider cabinet, had kind of psyched themselves into this, from this March '56 period. And if I can just kind of run you through the chain of thinking in March '56. This is in the wake of the riot in Bahrain, the sacking of Glubb. And it's this. They conclude that NASA isn't willing to work with the West, that there was no basis for friendly relations with Egypt, that we would do our utmost, our British utmost, to counter Egyptian policy, and that action would be taken against Egypt over the funding of the Aswan Dam. And there is also the reference in Anthony Nuttin's on you know, I want him destroyed. And I think that it had become almost inconceivable that there would be a peaceful settlement. I think much of British policy is kind of struggling to find that casus belli, that cause for war. If you can't do the military operation immediately, which they can't because they're prepared either for a general kind of Third World War, or they're prepared for counterinsurgency but not a mid-range war. If you're being told that you're on very dodgy ground international law-wise to do this, that you need a provocation, I think they're struggling, but I think they are determined that there will be a resolution by force. The fact that the 6 principles, which are hammered out in early October, are ultimately pretty much what are signed in early '57. I think kind of bears that out.
War is an extension of diplomacy.
Yeah.
In 1955, when they had the secret American plan about Alpha, which, by the way, was to force Israel to give up 2/3 of its sovereign territory in the Negev for a vague promise that maybe the Arabs wouldn't attack. And in Project Alpha, they talk about if NASA is not willing to cooperate, basically they're already talking about taking him out. Now, in terms of casus belli, there were 710 reasons for the Americans to attack Iraq. Sorry, I've got the paper upside down.
Yeah.
So the question here is
Oil.
The question here is that, and this is the debate amongst the Americans. Nixon was a vice president at the time, and there is a certain disagreement as to whether, if the British managed to do what they were going to do very, very quickly and get it over and done with, maybe the Americans were willing to turn a blind eye. This is subject to debate. But because it took them so long with the French, the Americans had no other alternative. And again, do not underestimate the importance of the Hungarian uprising and the Soviet invasion. So in terms of a war, this was quite acceptable. It was we call it today system change. And the idea was that if it happened, the Americans did it the whole time, the British did it. If a particular leader didn't play ball, you basically had system change. And they underestimated the power that Nasser had, his popularity. He was not a corrupt leader. He was the first Arab leader to speak in a dialect that all Arabs could understand. This is very, very important. And the British thought that they could get it over and done with very quickly. So this was perfectly acceptable. The Americans did it the whole time, but the British basically didn't do it properly, and that's part of the reason why, in the end, it was a debacle.
Just to add to that, if you look at the war aims of the British military operations, Musketeer Revice, what you will find is that it is about, in contemporary parlance, regime change. It's not about the canal. It's about NASA and regime change.